The cold came first, always. Before the ache in her knees, before the burn across her knuckles, before the smell of lye and wet stone settled into her hair like something permanent, the cold came first. It seeped through the cracks in the flagstone floor of Ironvale Keep and climbed up through the thin fabric of Lyra Vessing's dress as if it had a personal grievance against her. She had stopped noticing it years ago. Cold was just another part of her, like the faded birthmark on her collarbone or the silence she wore like armor. She wrung the mop into the rusted bucket and watched the water run grey, then darker. There had been a fight in the upper corridor last night. 2 young beaters from visiting packs, too much wine, too much posturing. They had bled on each other and on the marble floors, and by morning someone had pointed at Lyra the way people pointed at brooms and dust rags, without looking at her face. Faster. She told herself before anyone else could. She was always telling herself that. Lyra Vessing was 20 years old. She had lived inside Ironvale Keep for as long as she could remember, which was not quite the same as saying she had ever truly lived there. The wolves who filled these halls, who ate at the long dining table and argued about territory lines and howled at the full moon in the courtyard, they lived here. Lyra existed here. There was a difference, and everyone understood it without saying so. She had no wolf. Or so they believed. She had no pack, no family name worth claiming, no one who would notice if she disappeared between one breath and the next. Alpha Fennec Voss had inherited her the way one inherits old furniture, without enthusiasm, without warmth, simply because getting rid of it required more effort than keeping it. And so she stayed. Invisible. Useful in the way stones are useful when you need something to stand on. She was rinsing the last section of floor when the heels clicked. Sharp, deliberate, the sound of someone who wanted to be heard before they arrived. Lyra did not look up. She had learned that looking up was an invitation. Still on the ground, I see. Dosha Krell descended the corridor staircase like she was performing for an audience only she could see. She was the beater's daughter, tall, luminous, with copper hair pinned into an elaborate arrangement and eyes the color of dark honey. She was the kind of beautiful that had been sharpened into a weapon over years of careful practice. The water in this bucket, Dosha said, stopping close enough that her shadow fell across Lyra's hands. Smells like something died in it. Lyra said nothing. She wrung the mop again. I'm speaking to you. I heard you, Lyra said quietly. Her voice was even. She had trained it to be even the way one trains a limb after an injury, slowly, deliberately, with a great deal of private pain. Dosha crouched down. It was a theatrical gesture, designed to force eye contact. Her perfume was thick and floral, something expensive from the southern markets that always made Lyra's nose burn. She looked at Lyra the way someone looks at a stain they cannot quite identify. You have the most unsettling eyes, Dosha said. I've told you before. Silver irises on someone like you, it's wrong. Like something that doesn't belong in its own body. Lyra met her gaze. She always made herself do that, no matter how much it cost her. She would not look away. She would not give Dosha the satisfaction of watching her flinch. Something shifted in Dosha's expression. A flicker of unease, quickly smothered by disdain. The summit guests begin arriving at sundown, Dosha said, straightening. Her tone returned to its usual tone of bored authority. Alpha Fennec wants every corridor spotless. The Great Hall, the East Wing, the lower passages. All of it. I'll finish. You'll finish because if you don't, I'll make sure you spend the next week in the punishment yard. Dosha tilted her head. Oh, and the servants' quarters are closed tonight. The guests need the East Wing, which means you're in the stables. Lyra stared at the floor. The stables in November. The wind came through the gaps in the wooden walls and the horse's breath made more warmth than the blankets did. Do you understand me? Yes. Yes, what? A pause. A long one. The kind Lyra filled with every word she could not say. Yes, Miss Krell. Dosha smiled. It was the smile of someone who had just won something they hadn't needed to fight for. Good. And don't even think about wandering toward the ballroom tonight. The Alpha King is attending this summit. Her voice dropped into something theatrical and hushed. The actual Obsidian King. Cale Voss himself. If he even glimpsed something like you in his vicinity, the insult alone would. I understand, Lyra said. Dosha studied her for a moment longer, as if hoping to find something she could punish. Then she turned and walked away, her heels clicking their exit like a closing argument. Lyra stayed on her knees for a moment after the sound faded. She pressed her palm flat against the cold stone floor and breathed. The birthmark on her collarbone ached. It had been doing that more often lately, a deep, internal throb, like something pressing against a door from the other side. She touched it through her dress without thinking, fingers finding the raised crescent shape the way a tongue finds a sore tooth. She stood. Picked up the bucket. Kept moving. By the time the last light bled out of the keep's high windows, Lyra had cleaned 4 corridors, the Great Hall's antechamber, and the east staircase. Her spine felt like it had been dismantled and reassembled incorrectly. Her hands had stopped hurting somewhere around the 3rd hour, which she knew from experience meant the nerves had simply given up protesting. She slipped into the kitchen through the servant's side door, moving quietly out of habit, the way water moves through stone, finding the path of least resistance, making no sound. Lyra. She went still. But the voice was soft. Safe. She exhaled. Mila was standing at the far end of the kitchen, a small woman with a spine curved by decades of hard work and a face that had decided warmth was worth keeping regardless of the cost. She was the head cook's assistant, and she had been the closest thing to kindness that Lyra had ever known in this place. She was holding out a cloth bundle. Come here, quickly. Mila's eyes moved to the doorway and back. Bread, some hard cheese, a few strips of dried venison. Eat before anyone sees. Lyra crossed the kitchen and took the bundle with hands that embarrassed her by trembling. You'll get in trouble. I'm 63 years old and I've survived 3 alpha successions in this keep, Mila said. I'll survive a dinner roll. She squeezed Lyra's hands and then held them for a moment, studying her. You look pale. Paler than usual. I'm always pale. There's pale and then there's see-through, child. Mila's voice dropped. Listen to me. There are whispers in the kitchen tonight. The kind that make old wolves nervous. She hesitated, glancing again at the doorway. The king didn't come here for politics. Everyone's saying it. He's been traveling between packs for months, searching for something. A bloodline, they're saying. One that was declared extinct 300 years ago. Lyra stopped chewing. The elder wolves are frightened, Mila continued quietly. I've never seen old Grimshaw look like that. White as a sheet, he was, when the king's advance riders arrived. What bloodline? I don't know the name. But I heard one of the riders say. Mila stopped herself. Her expression shifted into something careful. Never mind what I heard. Just stay hidden tonight, Lyra. Whatever the king is searching for, it has nothing to do with people like us. Stay in the stables. Stay quiet. Stay safe, Lyra finished. Mila looked at her. Something in the old woman's eyes was sorry. Yes, Mila said gently. Safe. The stables were cold and smelled of hay and warm animal and old leather, which was not entirely unpleasant. Lyra sat on her thin bedroll in the corner farthest from the draught, eating the bread in small pieces to make it last, and watched the flicker of light from the keep's high windows spill across the hay-covered floor. Music drifted down from the great hall. Something orchestral, something that moved like water over stones. She reached under the bedroll and pulled out the only thing she had ever kept hidden. A dress. Midnight blue silk, so dark it looked like liquid shadow, with thin silver embroidery running along the neckline like starlight frozen in fabric. She had found it 3 years ago in a pile of things marked for burning, a torn hem, a stain on the sleeve cuff that had come out with patient work. She had mended every inch of it by candlelight, stitch by stitch, over months. She had never worn it. She had told herself she was keeping it for no reason, the way one keeps a beautiful stone picked up from a riverbank. Just because. She held it up in the sliver of light from the window. From the great hall, she could hear voices rising over the music. She caught words in fragments. Magnificent. He arrived an hour ago. Colder than the rumors. More beautiful though. Absolutely terrifying and absolutely. She pulled the dress on over her head. The silk settled against her like something that had been waiting. In the cracked mirror nailed to the stable wall, a girl looked back at her. Silver eyes wide, pale hair loose around her face, collarbone bare with its crescent mark catching the dim light. She looked like no one she recognized. Which was, she realized, exactly the point. Among the discarded decoration crates stacked in the stable corner, left over from last year's winter festival, she found it. A silver mask, delicate as pressed leaves, shaped like overlapping crescent moons. She pressed it against her face. Her birthmark flared warm against her skin. Tonight, a voice whispered. Not her own voice. Something older, something that lived in the walls of her chest like an echo from a room she had never entered. Tonight, Lyra. She should have been afraid of that voice. She had been, once. Now it felt less like a warning and more like a door swinging open. She was going to get caught. She was going to be punished. She would likely spend the next week in the punishment yard, and Dosha would have new material for months. None of it mattered the way it had this morning. She straightened her spine. She breathed. And then she walked out of the stables, across the courtyard, and through the servants' side entrance of Ironvale Keep. The masquerade was a world she had only ever watched through cracked doors. Up close, it was overwhelming, a fever of silk and shadow and refracted candlelight, hundreds of masked wolves moving through the great hall like a slow, glittering current. The air was thick with perfume and tension and something electric that she felt against her skin like the air before lightning. She stayed at the edges, one hand light against the wall, letting the crowd flow past her without touching her. No one looked twice. She had spent 20 years trying not to be noticed. Tonight, for the first time, she chose it deliberately, and the invisibility felt different. It felt like armor. She heard the name pass between lips like a prayer, like a held breath. Kale Voss. The king. The obsidian. She did not look for him. Some instinct said that looking for something like that was its own kind of danger. Instead she drifted, catching conversations, feeling the strange, wild lightness of existing in a room where no one knew her name. A server moved past with a tray of champagne glasses and she took one, more for something to hold than to drink. She found her way to the terrace almost without meaning to. The doors were open, and cold night air reached through them like a hand. She stepped out onto the stone balcony and the sounds of the hall fell away behind her. The Ironvale cliffs stretched below, dark and vast, the winter sea crashing white against the rocks. The moon was almost full, heavy and luminous, and the light it cast on the terrace made everything look like it had been cut from silver. She leaned against the stone railing and let herself breathe for the first time all day. Slipping away already? The voice came from her left, low, effortless, warm like embers under ash. She turned. He was leaning against the far balustrade in the dark, arms folded, watching her with an expression she could not quite name. Tall. Broad-shouldered. Dressed in black with a plain obsidian mask across the upper half of his face, leaving his jaw bare, defined, shadowed, carved like something that had been made slowly and with intention. And his eyes. Silver. Pure, pale, liquid silver. The color of the Voss bloodline, the royal bloodline. She knew that from the servants' whispers, from the old stories, from the way the older wolves spoke of the royal family like they were weather patterns instead of people. Her heart kicked once. She knew who this was. The scandal sheets made their way into the servants' quarters every few weeks, crumpled and half-read, and the name that appeared in them most often, alongside tales of broken engagements and midnight disappearances and a long trail of swooning noble daughters, was Caden Voss. The Alpha King's younger brother. The charming rogue. The beautiful disaster. The safe one. The thrill that moved through her was reckless. She recognized it. She did not stop it. The music inside, she said, letting her voice settle into something steadier than she felt, is playing the same song for the third time. He tilted his head. A faint smile. You counted. I have a good ear. He pushed off the balustrade and took one slow step toward her. The moonlight found more of him, dark hair slightly unsettled by the wind, a thin scar cutting through his left brow, that silver gaze moving over her face with the deliberate attention of someone who did not hurry at anything. You're not from Ironvale, he said. It wasn't a question. What makes you say that? You're standing at the edge of a cliff in November without flinching. Ironvale wolves don't like the heights. Something about the salt wind. He took another step. Also, you're the only person at this masquerade who hasn't looked toward the doors in the last 20 minutes waiting to catch a glimpse of the king. Maybe I already saw him, she said. Something moved across his expression. Did you? I haven't decided yet. He laughed. Quiet, genuine, the kind of laugh that came from somewhere that hadn't expected to. It did something unexpected to the air between them. She let her chin lift. Let herself lean into the version of herself the night had made possible, the one in the blue silk dress with the silver mask and 20 years of silence finally finding an edge. I've heard stories about you, she said. His eyes sharpened with amusement. Only the good ones, I hope. They say you're charming and reckless and that you've left half the noble daughters in 9 territories absolutely devastated. He was close now. Close enough that she could smell him. Cedar and cold night air and something underneath that was deeper, darker, the kind of scent that asked questions instead of answering them. And what do you think? He asked, his voice dropping to something that moved through the air like smoke. I think, she said, that someone very comfortable with being the most dangerous person in the room would never admit to it at a party. A pause. Those silver eyes on hers, unblinking. Clever little flame, he murmured. And then he leaned in. Close enough that the warmth of him cut through the November cold. Close enough that his mouth nearly brushed the curve of her ear, and she felt the words more than heard them, felt them in her throat, her sternum, her birthmark that flared hot and sudden against her collarbone. Wrong brother, little flame. The world went very, very quiet. She pulled back and looked at him. Really looked, past the mask, past the smirk, at those silver eyes that were not amused anymore. They were something else. Something older. Something that looked at her like a map that had just been found after a very long search. The voice in her chest said nothing. It didn't need to. It had known this was coming. The silence between them lasted exactly 4 heartbeats. Lyra counted them. Felt each one in her throat like a stone dropping into still water. Wrong brother, little flame. The words hung in the cold November air, delicate and devastating, and she watched his face with the helpless attention of someone watching a wall crack open and not yet knowing what was behind it. She wanted to laugh. She wanted to run. She wanted the Ironvale cliffs behind her to simply open up and swallow her whole, dress and mask and all. But his eyes would not let her go. Not silver like a mirror. Silver like a weapon newly sharpened, pale, precise, with an edge that caught the moonlight and held it. She had seen that particular shade described in the servants' quarters once, in a crumpled scandal sheet Mila had passed to her under the kitchen table. The king's eyes are the color of a winter sky before the storm decides what it wants to do. She had thought that was the kind of thing writers invented. Exaggerated for effect. It was not exaggerated. It was, if anything, insufficient. Kale Voss, she said. Her own voice surprised her. It came out quiet, but it did not shake. She was distantly proud of that. In the flesh, he said. He had not moved back. He was still close, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off him in defiance of the cold, close enough that breathing required a conscious decision. You seem remarkably calm for someone who just realized they've been flirting with the Alpha King of 9 territories. I'm not calm, Lyra said honestly. I'm just very practiced at looking like I am. Something shifted in his expression. Not amusement exactly. Something more careful than that. Those eyes, he said softly, and there was an odd note in his voice now, something that didn't belong to the easy confidence of everything else about him. Something searching. What is your name? She opened her mouth. The terrace doors exploded open behind her. Torchlight flooded the balcony in a violent wash of orange and gold, and with it came the sound she had been dreading since she stepped into this dress, the sound of Dosha Krell's voice, high and bright with the specific pleasure of someone who has been waiting all evening for exactly this moment. There Dosha stood in the doorway, one arm extended, copper hair catching the torchlight like fire. Her honey-dark eyes were fixed on Lyra with an expression of pure vindictive satisfaction. I would know those eyes anywhere. Silver irises, completely unnatural. That is the packless servant. She stole that dress. She has no right to be here. Behind Dosha, 2 Ironvale guards pushed through the doorway. And behind them, with the measured stride of a man who considered urgency beneath him, came Alpha Fennec Voss. Lyra's stomach turned to ice. Fennec Voss was a tall man with a face like weathered granite, not ugly, but hard in a way that suggested softness had been deliberately removed. He wore his authority the way he wore his coat, without thinking about it, as if it were simply part of his body. His pale eyes swept the terrace, catalogued it in seconds, and landed on Lyra with the flat recognition of a man identifying something that belonged to him. "Lyra Vessin," he said. His voice was not raised. It never needed to be. "You have violated the laws of Ironvale Pack. You have entered a summit gathering without rank or invitation. You have stolen pack property." He paused. "The punishment is 40 lashes administered at dawn, followed by immediate exile beyond the territory boundary with nothing but the clothing on your back." The words landed on her like stones. 40 lashes. She had received 10 once, for breaking a ceramic pot, and she had not been able to stand straight for 2 weeks. The guards stepped forward. Cale's hand closed around her wrist. Not tight. Not painful. Just there. A fact. An anchor. His fingers wrapped around the inside of her wrist, and the warmth of it moved up her arm and into her chest like something her body recognized before her mind did. The guards stopped. They stopped because the Alpha King had not removed his gaze from Fennec Voss. And the look in those silver eyes was not anger. Anger would have been easier to bear. This was something quieter and more absolute. The look of a man who had already decided the outcome of the conversation and was simply waiting for everyone else to understand it. "You dare," Cale said, "to issue commands on a terrace where I am standing." The words were soft. That was the most frightening thing about them. They had no heat in them, the way deep water has no heat, still and dark and unfathomably heavy. Fennec's jaw tightened. "Your Majesty," the deference was there, but it cost him something. Lyra could see it in the line of his shoulders. "I apologize for the disruption. This creature is the property of Ironvale Pack. A wolfless omega, found abandoned as an infant and kept out of charity. Whatever she may have told you, she is nothing. Nobody. A servant who has clearly lost her senses. Property." The word pressed into Lyra's ribs like a thumb on a bruise. "She told me nothing," Cale said. "We were talking." Talking. Dosha stepped forward, her voice sweet in the way that poison is sometimes sweet, a surface coating over something that kills. "She was performing, Your Majesty. She does that. Talks to herself in the lower corridors, claims she hears voices. The wolfless omega who thought she could play at being a noble for a night." Dosha's lips curved. "My father always said we should have turned her out at the first winter. Some things just don't belong." A murmur moved through the wolves who had crowded into the doorway to watch. Lyra heard them without looking. She had become very good at receiving cruelty from her peripheral vision. Wolfless. How does she even stand without a wolf to anchor her? Look at her. Thin as paper. She probably. Cale had still not released her wrist. Fennec stepped onto the terrace, and there was a moment, just a moment, where he seemed to forget himself, where the authority he wore so comfortably made him do something catastrophically foolish. He closed the distance between himself and Lyra and gripped her other arm with bruising force. "Enough of this," Fennec said. "She comes with me." The temperature on the terrace dropped. It was not a metaphor. Lyra felt it on her bare shoulders, a cold that had nothing to do with the November wind. It rolled outward from Cale Voss like the tide pulling back before a wave, slow and immense and promising something enormous. Cale turned his head and looked at Fennec's hand on Lyra's arm. He looked at it for a long time. "Remove your hand," Cale said quietly, "from what is not yours to touch. She is Ironvale Pack. She is standing next to me." Cale's silver eyes moved from Fennec's hand to Fennec's face, and whatever Fennec found there made the Alpha of Ironvale Pack go very still. "And I decide what happens to people standing next to me. Is that something you would like to argue about, Fennec?" Fennec released her arm. The crowd in the doorway had gone silent. Lyra could feel 500 pairs of eyes on her back, 500 held breaths, 500 wolves suddenly uncertain of the gravity of the room. And then Elder Grimshaw spoke. He was at the back of the crowd, ancient, white-haired, with a face so lined it looked like a map of somewhere very old. He was Seralda's grandfather in the original story, but here he was Ironvale's oldest surviving wolf, the pack elder who had served through 4 alpha reigns. Lyra had seen him perhaps a dozen times in 20 years. He had never once looked at her. He was looking at her now. His face was the color of old ash. The wineglass in his hand hit the floor without him noticing. It shattered and no one moved. The mark, Grimshaw breathed. His voice was barely sound. Barely anything. On her collarbone. The crescent and the flame, he was shaking. Lyra realized she had never seen an elder wolf shake before. They were not built for it. That is the Lunara mark. That is not possible. We made certain. We were told. Told what? Cale's voice cut clean and precise across the whisper. Grimshaw's mouth worked without sound for a moment. His eyes were fixed on Lyra's collarbone with an expression that was not quite horror and not quite reverence and was somehow, terribly, both at once. The Lunara bloodline, the old wolf said finally. The moon's chosen. They were declared extinct 3 centuries ago. His voice dropped until Lyra had to strain to hear it. Because they were hunted, Your Majesty. Because the packs, the old alpha councils, decided they were too powerful. Too dangerous. They were tracked down, every branch of the family, every child, he stopped. Swallowed. We were told none survived. We were told, Cale repeated slowly. Who told you that, Elder Grimshaw? The old wolf's eyes dropped to the floor. His silence was its own kind of answer. Lyra was not listening anymore. Or rather, she was listening to something else entirely. Something beneath the voices and the crowd and the cold wind off the cliffs. Something that had been whispering to her since she was old enough to notice it, that had grown louder every year like a tide coming in, that had roared in her chest when she collapsed in the dungeon and screamed when she was 12 and alone and frightened in the punishment yard and wept silently into the stable hay every night she spent in the cold. The mark on her collarbone was no longer aching. It was burning. Not painfully. Not like a wound. Like a fire finding its fuel after a very long search. She looked down at her own hands. The skin along her fingers was beginning to glow. Not the pale luminescence of sickness or fever, something cleaner than that. Something that pulsed in time with her heartbeat, slow and rhythmic and deeply, bone-shakingly certain of itself. The silver embroidery on her dress caught the light and multiplied it, and for one surreal moment she looked like she had been dipped in moonlight and had not yet dried. Lyra, Cale's voice. Close. Focused. She felt him turn toward her. Lyra, look at me. She tried. The pain hit before she could. Not sharp, vast. A tidal wave of sensation that started in her spine and expanded outward in every direction simultaneously, like something that had been compressed into a space too small for it for 20 years had finally found a door. She heard herself make a sound. She felt her knees go. Cale caught her before she hit the marble. His arms were around her in a single motion, no hesitation, no calculation, just the immediate and decisive movement of someone who had decided something he was not going to argue with himself about. She felt his chest against her shoulder, felt the warmth of him steady against the shaking that had taken over her entire body. What is happening to her? Dosha's voice. Shrill now. Frightened in a way that almost satisfied something deep in Lyra's chest even through the roaring pain. Her wolf is waking, Cale said. And his voice had changed. The cool precision was still there, but underneath it was something Lyra had never heard directed at her from anyone. Something that sounded like it mattered. Something that sounded like her mattering. She has no wolf, Fenix said. She has never shifted. She is wolfless, she was born. She was born Lunara, Cale said. And the Lunara do not shift like ordinary wolves. He looked down at Lyra, and she looked up at him through the haze of pain and light, through the burning mark and the roaring voice inside her chest. His silver eyes were steady. They were the only steady thing in the world right now. The Lunara wake when they are ready, he said quietly. And it looks like 20 years of this place have made her very, very ready. The light pouring from her skin intensified. Somewhere in the crowd, someone screamed. The pain crested, white and enormous and absolute. And Lyra Vessin, packless servant of Ironvale Keep, scrubber of floors and sleeper of stables and invisible girl in a borrowed dress, opened her mouth and made a sound that was not quite human anymore. The chandelier crystals in the great hall behind them shivered. Then shattered. Every single one. The sound that tore out of her was older than language. It moved through the walls of Ironvale Keep like a shockwave, not loud in the way thunder is loud, but deep in the way the earth is deep, resonating through marble and stone and bone and the marrow inside bone until there was no one in the great hall, no one on the terrace, no one in the long corridors above or the cold cellars below who did not feel it pass through them like a tide. The chandeliers had already shattered. The long dining table cracked cleanly down the center as if a patient hand had finally decided it had waited long enough. And where Lyra Vessin had been, trembling, hollow-cheeked, barefoot on a cold balcony in a mended blue dress, something else was rising. It was not fast, the way lightning is fast. It was inevitable, the way the sun is inevitable, steady and enormous and entirely unconcerned with whether you were ready for it. The wolf that emerged from Lyra's body was white. Not grey-white, not the pale winter coat of a northern pack wolf. White the way the moon is white, its own light source, each strand of fur catching the dark and returning it as radiance, a halo of luminescence that cast shadows backward, that made the torches around the terrace seem dim and apologetic by comparison. She was massive. Larger than any wolf the Ironvale wolves had ever seen, larger than their alpha's shifted form, larger than the legendary tracker wolves of the northern territories that were spoken of in the same awed tone as natural disasters. She stood at the terrace railing and the stone beneath her paws cracked from the sheer weight of her aura, pressure lines splitting through the marble in slow, deliberate spiderwebs. Her eyes, when she opened them, were not violet anymore. They were gold. Deep, burning, ancient gold, the color of candlelight inside amber, of firelight on still water, of something that had been kept in the dark for a very long time and was now, quietly and without apology, done with that. On her forehead, visible through the white fur like a brand, the crescent moon mark blazed. The Lunara crest. The moon's flame. A symbol so old that half the wolves in the great hall didn't recognize it, and the other half wished they didn't. Elder Grimshaw did not scream. He did something worse. He dropped to his knees in the doorway and covered his face with his hands and made a sound like a man confronting a debt he had always known was coming. The rest of the room followed. It was not a request. The white wolf had not moved, had not growled, had not done anything so crude as threaten. She simply was, and the weight of what she was pressed downward through the room like a hand pressing the surface of still water, irresistible, unhurried, vast. The Omegas went first, instantly and completely, knees hitting the floor before their minds had processed why. Then the beaters, fighting it for seconds, looking confused and frightened as their bodies chose submission independent of their pride. The alphas lasted longer. Lyra could feel their resistance against her aura like fish pushing against a current, stubborn and ultimately futile. Dosha Krell dropped mid-sentence. One moment she was standing in the doorway with her mouth open, copper hair gleaming, performing the last desperate act of a woman who had spent her entire life using cruelty as currency, and the next her knees simply gave, and she hit the marble floor and had to press her hands against it to stop herself from folding entirely flat. The expression on her face when she looked up at the white wolf was something Lyra filed away in the private part of herself that had survived 20 years of this place. Pure, unfiltered, objectless terror. Not directed at anything Dosha had done. Terror at what she had failed to understand was right in front of her all along. Fennec Voss was last. He fought it longer than anyone. His face went through fury and disbelief and a kind of frantic recalculation before the inevitable. The Alpha of Ironvale Keep, who had inherited Lyra the way one inherits unwanted furniture, who had given the order for 40 lashes without altering his expression, went down slowly, as if he were lowering himself deliberately, as if it were a choice. It was not a choice. Lyra could feel it from the inside, the moment his wolf capitulated completely, collapsing like a wall that had been undermined from beneath for longer than he knew. His forehead touched marble. The marble she had scrubbed on her knees 1,000 times. The wolf that was Lyra stood over the room and was quiet in the way that deep things are quiet. Not empty. Full, of 20 years of cold mornings and stolen bread and the particular specific weight of being seen through instead of seen. Not angry, exactly. Past anger, the way the ocean is past angry, a thing that has simply become what it is, indifferent to whether that frightens you. Only one person in the great hall remained standing. She had known he would. Cale Voss stood at the terrace threshold where he had caught her when her knees gave, still, precise, with his coat open and his silver eyes fixed on her with an expression that made the gold fire in her own eyes waver slightly, like a flame in wind. He was not kneeling. He was not fleeing. He was not performing the calculated stillness of a man suppressing fear. He looked like a man who had spent a long time looking for something and was now quietly adjusting to the fact that he had found it. Lunara, he said. Just that word. Just her bloodline's name, spoken in a voice that held it like something rare. He walked toward her. No hesitation. No caution. The steady, deliberate walk of a man who had decided, somewhere in the last 10 minutes, that he was not going to treat her like something to be managed. He crossed the terrace until he stood 5 feet from the white wolf, close enough that she could have ended him with a single motion, and then he stopped, and he looked at her, and she looked back. We searched every territory, he said quietly. 12 packs. 3 years. Every rumor, every old record, every fragment of evidence that the Lunara bloodline had survived what was done to it. His voice was even, but something underneath it was not entirely even. I had almost decided the hunt had no end. The wolf, Lyra, made a sound. Low and resonant, not threatening. More like an acknowledgement. Shift back, he said. And where another man might have made it a command, he made it something else. An offering, almost. You're safe. No one in this hall will lay a hand on you. I give you my word as Alpha King, and if that word is not enough, a flicker of something that was almost wry, I invite you to note that everyone in your vicinity is currently unable to stand up. A beat. And then, slowly, the gold fire in her eyes began to bank. The light dimmed the way light dims at the end of a day, not suddenly, but with a gentle and inexorable fading, as if the thing that had needed to be seen had been seen and was now content to rest. Fur receded into skin. Bones reformed with the sound of settling ice. The massive white shape contracted, shrank, reshaped, until Lyra Vessing knelt on the cracked marble of the Ironvale terrace, human and shivering and completely undone, her pale hair falling around her like something that had been holding itself up for a very long time and had finally stopped. She was shaking so hard her teeth clicked. Cale's coat settled over her shoulders before she had registered him moving. It was warm. It smelled of cedar and cold night air and something underneath that was him specifically, that dark, stormy, deeply particular scent that she had noticed on the balcony what felt like a century ago. She pulled it tighter around herself with fingers that trembled, and she looked at the cracked marble floor, and she did not cry. She had made herself that promise 20 years ago in a cold stable when she was 6 years old and didn't understand what she was promising, and she had kept it every single time since, and she would keep it now. She felt his presence lower beside her. Not towering over her. Not standing at a distance that would be appropriate for an Alpha King addressing a packless Omega. He crouched down until he was at her level, and he looked at her face, and she made herself look back at him. Up close, without the mask, he was almost unreasonably beautiful in the way of things that were not designed with approachability in mind. Clean angles, deep-set silver eyes framed by lashes too dark for his coloring, that jaw she had noticed on the terrace when she still thought he was someone safer. The thin scar through his left brow that she hadn't noticed in the dark was more visible now, a pale line cutting through the arch of it. He was looking at her the way no one had ever looked at her. Not through her, not past her, not at her as a problem to be categorized. Directly at her, the way you look at something you are trying to memorize. Your name, he said. Your real name. She swallowed. Lyra. Lyra Vessing. Something moved across his face. Recognition, deep and specific, the expression of a man hearing something confirmed that he had not been certain he would ever hear. Lyra Vessing, he repeated, quietly. I have been looking for you for 3 years, he paused. And apparently everyone who was supposed to keep you hidden was standing approximately 40 feet from where I spent the evening. She almost laughed. The almost laugh surprised her. The scandal sheets said you were cold. They said you were terrifying. They said you hadn't smiled in public in 6 years. The scandal sheets have never met anyone worth smiling at, he said. And the corner of his mouth curved, just slightly, just enough to be unmistakable. The warmth that moved through her chest had nothing to do with the coat. He stood, turned to face the room. The 500 wolves of the Ironvale summit were still on their knees. Some had managed to sit back on their heels. None had risen. The hall was so silent that Lyra could hear the wind off the cliffs and the distant creak of the damaged chandelier frames overhead. Cale Voss looked at them for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried effortlessly through the hall, not raised, simply built for carrying, the voice of a man whose words had never needed reinforcement. Let it be known, he said, that the Lunara bloodline is not extinct. Let it be known that the last daughter of the Moon's Chosen has been found, and that she is under the direct protection of the crown. Any hand raised against her is a hand raised against me. Any claim of ownership, of punishment, of exile, his silver gaze moved to Fennec, still prostrated on the floor, is void as of this moment and retroactively recognized as what it always was, the abuse of a royal bloodline by people who believed they would never be made to answer for it. Fennec's hands pressed flat against the marble. You will answer, Cale said, without particular drama. The lack of drama made it worse. Not tonight. Tonight, you will rise when I give you leave to rise, and you will sign whatever documents my general places before you, and you will be grateful that the punishment I'm considering begins with only the removal of your title. He turned to Elder Grimshaw. The old wolf had not moved. Still on his knees in the doorway, still with his hands covering his face, still making that quiet sound of a man reckoning with something long overdue. Grimshaw, Cale said. The elder lowered his hands. His face, when it emerged, was old in a new way, stripped of whatever had been propping it up. He looked at Lyra. I was young, he said. It was not an excuse. The old wolf's voice said clearly that he knew it was not an excuse. When the order came. To say the Lunara line was gone. To confirm it to the councils. We were told they had already been, that it was already done, and that the confirmation was only, his voice broke. I told myself it was only a formality. That it changed nothing. That I was not, I told myself. You lied, Lyra said. Her own voice surprised her. It came out clear. It came out from somewhere in her chest that had been quiet for 20 years and had apparently decided it was finished with that. The old wolf looked at her. Yes, he said. I lied. I want you to remember this floor, she said. I want you to remember what it feels like to kneel on it. Because I have knelt on this specific floor every day for 10 years, and I never, not once, had the choice of whether to. Grimshaw closed his eyes. Dosha Krell was not crying. Dosha Krell was doing something more complete than crying. She was sitting back on her heels with her perfect copper hair coming apart at its pins and her honey-dark eyes staring at the floor of a room she had always believed belonged to her, and she was confronting the particular specific silence of someone who has run out of cruelties to spend. Every weapon she had ever carried had evaporated in the last 20 minutes, and without them she was just a woman on a cold floor trying to understand who she was without someone to be cruel to. Lyra looked at her for a long moment. She thought about 10 years of jasmine perfume and clicking heels. She thought about every version of freak and ghost and cursed that had been delivered with such deliberate artistry, such practiced precision. She thought about the stables in November and the 40 lashes that had been ordered 45 minutes ago as casually as one orders a meal. She thought about Mila. Standing in the kitchen with a cloth bundle and warm brown eyes and I'll survive a dinner roll, child. Where is Mila? Lyra asked. Cale glanced at his general, a broad-shouldered man named Soren who had appeared at some point in the last few minutes with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent a long career turning chaos into logistics. Soren was already moving. 3 minutes later, Mila appeared in the doorway. The old cook's assistant stood at the threshold of the great hall and looked at the 500 wolves on their knees and the shattered chandeliers and the cracked marble and the Alpha King of 9 territories standing next to a girl in a too large black coat, and her brown eyes moved from the carnage to Lyra's face. And then Mila, 63 years old, who had survived 3 Alpha successions, crossed the great hall through the kneeling crowd without looking at any of them, and put her small worn hands on either side of Lyra's face. I told you tonight would be different, Mila said. Lyra's composure, which had held through the transformation and the kneeling crowd and the elder's confession and Dosh's silence, did a very creditable job of surviving that too. It managed approximately 4 more seconds. Mila pulled her in, and Lyra pressed her face against the old woman's shoulder, and said nothing, and the hall said nothing, and for a moment the only sounds were the wind off the cliffs and the distant settling of cracked marble. Later, much later, after the documents had been signed and the crowd had been released and Fennec Voss had been escorted to a room whose lock would not open from the inside, Cale found Lyra on the terrace again. She had found her way back to it instinctively, the way you return to the place where something important happened. She was standing at the railing where she had stood when she thought she was flirting with a playboy prince, looking out at the Ironvale cliffs. The winter sea crashed white against the rocks 100 feet below. The moon, almost full, hung enormous and luminous above the water. Her birthmark no longer ached. For the first time in her memory, the crescent on her collarbone was simply part of her, not a pressure, not a warning, not something pressing from the inside against a locked door. Just a mark. Just hers. She heard Cale step onto the terrace. She didn't turn. He came to stand beside her at the railing. Close, but not with the calculated closeness of the earlier part of the evening. Simply close, the way 2 people stand when they have decided, without negotiating it, that the distance between them has served its purpose. The Lunara bloodline, Lyra said, still looking at the sea. What does it actually mean? Not the history. Not what the elders were afraid of, she paused. What does it mean for me? He was quiet for a moment. She appreciated that he didn't answer immediately. She had learned to distrust immediate answers. It means, he said finally, that you are not packless. You never were. You belong to the oldest line in the continent's history, a bloodline that doesn't require a pack's validation to exist. The Lunara were never meant to be owned by territories. They existed above them. He looked out at the sea. They were the ones the packs came to when everything else had failed. When borders collapsed. When the old treaties broke. The Moon's Chosen were the ones who held the center. And someone decided that was too dangerous, Lyra said. Power concentrated in one bloodline, independent of the Alpha Councils. He nodded. Yes. 3 centuries ago, someone decided the solution was to remove the bloodline. The sea crashed against the cliffs below. Lyra watched the spray catch the moonlight and scatter it into 1,000 brief lights. Your eyes, she said. They were looking at me before I came out here tonight. In the great hall, before I went to the balcony, she turned and looked at him for the first time since they'd come out here. You already suspected. I noticed your mark when you passed under the chandelier in the east corridor, he said. I wasn't certain. The crest is old. I'd only seen it in documents. Something shifted in his expression. Then you came out here and I was certain. And then I walked up to you and started flirting, Lyra said. The corner of his mouth moved. You thought I was Caden. The scandal sheets described him very thoroughly. Caden is 3 inches shorter than me and currently causing diplomatic incidents in the Southern Territories, Cale said. He sends me cheerful letters about it. She laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded and surprised, the kind she had almost forgotten she was capable of. It felt strange in her chest, like a room that had been closed for a long time being opened and found to still have good air in it. He was looking at her when she finished laughing. That direct, unhurried look that she was beginning to understand was simply what he looked like when he was paying attention, which appeared to be always. You're going to have to leave Ironvale, he said. Not tonight. But soon. There will be a great deal that follows from what happened here this evening, and it will be easier to manage if you're not in the middle of the territory where it started. I've been sleeping in the stables, Lyra said. I don't have much to pack. He looked at her steadily. Lyra. I'm not complaining, she said. I'm just noting that exile is not the threat they believed it was. It's not exile, he said. And something in his voice had changed, taken on the specificity of a man choosing words carefully because the wrong ones would not be sufficient. I want you to come to the Obsidian Court. Not as a refugee. Not as someone under protection in the purely logistical sense, he paused. I have been looking for the Lunara heir for 3 years. I did not spend 3 years searching because I needed another court ornament. The sea wind lifted her pale hair. The moon poured its light across the terrace in a wide, generous sweep. "You don't know me," she said. "Not as resistance. As honesty. I know that you walked into an Alpha King's masquerade in a mended dress and a borrowed mask and flirted with me for 10 minutes while believing you were doing something reckless and small," he said. "And that when every wolf in a room full of wolves was bowing, you held your chin up." He paused. "I know that the first thing you asked for after your transformation was a kitchen servant's location." Lyra was quiet. The birthmark on her collarbone was warm. Not burning. Warm, the specific warmth of something finally at rest, finally home in its own skin. "The voice," she said. "The one I heard for years. Inside my head. I thought I was losing my mind." "Your wolf," he said. Waiting. She was very patient. Apparently she had opinions about the right moment. Lyra looked at the moon. It looked back, as moons do, impartial and immense and completely unbothered by what happens in the small lit rooms of the world below it. 20 years of cold mornings. 20 years of lie-burned hands and stolen bread and Dosha's perfume and the particular sound of heels clicking toward her. 20 years of being the ghost, the freak, the cursed thing, the nobody in the corner that people looked past when they were counting what mattered. The mark on her collarbone glowed, just faintly, just warmly, in the dark. "One condition," she said. Kale looked at her. "Name it." "Mila comes too." The curve at the corner of his mouth became, briefly and completely, a smile. "Obviously," he said. Lyra turned away from the sea and faced the interior of Ironvale Keep. The cracked marble, the empty great hall, the long corridors she had cleaned on her knees, and she looked at all of it with silver eyes and a white wolf asleep in her chest and the weight of 3 centuries of buried history resting in her bones, and she felt, for the first time in 20 years, like something that had a right to take up space. She had walked in tonight as a ghost. She was leaving as the moon's daughter. And the moon, it turned out, had never forgotten her name. End.